the Mississippi Crop Situation Podcast featuring the Crop Doctors.
Good morning from the Crop Doctors Podcast studio in Stoneville. Andy Whittington from the Mississippi Farm Bureau Federation is here with Tom and I. Andy, good morning.
Good morning.
Andy was in Stoneville, and so Tom and I twisted his arm. He owed us, even though he's been on.
Calf roped him in here.
Yeah, he's been on here a few times, but what happened last year, Andy? Me and you and Tom and Jeff Gore were going to do this, and then did the meeting? You made it. You got here.
Yeah.
Did the meeting get canceled or what?
Yes.
What happened?
I can't remember.
No, the power went out.
That's right.
The power went out, and we couldn't connect.
That's right. Now I remember.
Yeah. We got knocked into the Stone Age, and so we didn't have a meeting, and Andy went back home. And we didn't get to do our podcast, so now we got him here.
Because mysteriously, people can't interact with one another if they don't have a device in their left or right hand.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what you're saying?
Well, when it was me and Andy and Jeff going to link up with another group, I mean, there was...
And we were in B.F. Smith, in that little small conference room. And when the power goes out, it's the darkest place.
Yeah. There's no window. Yeah. There's no window in there.
Oh, you were in Savely?
Yeah, because it used to be a courtyard, right?
It was a courtyard.
We are way off in the weeds now.
We are, but that's okay.
I just realized that I could pull this microphone closer to my face so I don't have to lean all the way over. So I'm going to be much more comfortable now that I have figured out that I could move the microphone closer to my face.
We try to please our guests, man. We try to...
It's amazing what kind of high-level things they let us discuss on this.
You got a bottle of water, or are you comfortable? Otherwise, do we need to turn the air down a little bit?
No, I'm good.
Okay, as long as you're comfortable and happy.
I'm pretty comfortable.
We had Stanley Culpepper and Larry Steckel. Yeah, they were together.
Were you going to ask him a question before we did that?
Okay. I am. I'm going to get to that, but I want to tell them what we're talking about first. So we had Larry Steckel and Stanley Culpepper at the short course last year, and we talked about the Endangered Species Act and the herbicide strategy that was coming. 6 months has gone by, and now we have the herbicide strategy has been delayed and is under revision. Is that a good word, Andy?
It is.
And the insecticide strategy and the fungicide strategy, and I guess the rodenticide strategy too, are all in different levels of preparation. And so that's what we're going to talk about with Andy today. Because, like I've told a lot of people, Andy knows more about this than anybody I know. Very complex.
That's a pretty scary thought.
Yeah, well, and me too, right? The more you hear about it and the more times you hear about it, maybe there are some nuggets that you can take home and digest and maybe put to use in the future. So, Andy, before we start, summertime, what is your preferred summertime treat? Are you a snow cone man or ice cream cone man?
Ice cream. Probably ice cream sandwich. That's a good summertime treat. Ice cream sandwich with the chocolate wafers, not the vanilla wafers.
See, my daughter is a snow cone fanatic, and I just don't. I like an icy, which is not snow cone. That's a slush, but man, a snow cone is just too sweet. I don't like it.
You didn't list my preferred option, so I will. I'll be quiet.
Lay it on us, Tom Allen.
No, I'm not gonna. Nope.
On our G-rated podcast, do you prefer snow cone or ice cream cone?
Neither. I'm an option C guy. You can do thumbs down on that for Tom. That's fine.
Thank you for being difficult. Back to Andy.
Yep.
Andy, the Endangered Species Act. We've talked about it. I talked about it at meetings last year, but there's going to be a lot of folks that really don't know what we're referring to when we say that. So as we begin a discussion, people may not have heard some of the other episodes that we've done related to this topic. So I guess to start, just describe to people what the Endangered Species Act is, and then as we progress, how it stands to influence all of our lives that work in allied agriculture.
I will do my best. The Endangered Species Act is probably one of the most powerful environmental laws that's on the books. And it is because it prioritizes species above pretty much everything else. You could see that going back to Tellico Dam when they shut down the Tellico Dam project with the Delta smelt. And I guess spotted owl is probably the most famous endangered species case, which was prevented logging in the Northwest. I can't remember exactly. It may have been Washington State. It's either Washington or Oregon.
That sounds right. I think it's Pacific Northwest
Yes.
as a general geographic region.
Correct. I think at that time, a lot of people figured out that they could use the Endangered Species Act not just to protect species, but to also to prevent activities that they didn't particularly care for. You've seen it used a lot. One of the most interesting is where it was used in Florida is the Florida key deer. They used that to prevent federal flood insurance for housing development, because they were saying that the flood insurance, because it was a federal action, that had to go through Endangered Species Act review, and the Florida key deer actually kept some of the development from happening. I think they wound up doing some mitigation, but it has a very strict hazard component to it. Well, you obviously can't take species, and you can't adversely modify species habitat. So it's not just the species, but it's also where the species lives and sometimes what the species would eat that can also affect you. If you look at monarch butterflies, that's a candidate for threatening Endangered Species Act. That's primarily what's happened with milkweed over time, because that's where the monarch butterfly lays its eggs. So it's not necessarily the number of monarch butterflies that are there, it's that their habitat is going away. So that's one of the reasons that it's a candidate. So there are a lot of different components to it, but unlike other statutes, FIFRA, which is the Federal Insecticide, Rodenticide, and Fungicide Act, which regulates pesticide registrations, FIFRA has a no unreasonable harm to the environment or human health. And it has a cost-benefit analysis that's associated with it. That's the difference between it and the Endangered Species Act, is the Endangered Species Act has that no adverse effect. So the unreasonable part's not in there, and there's no cost-benefit analysis associated with the Endangered Species Act. So cost and benefits doesn't matter when it's an Endangered Species Act case. It's just, does it or does it not adversely affect the species or its habitat?
High level, Andy, describe the historical pesticide labeling process, and then now that the Endangered Species Act is a component of that process, how it stands to evolve.
There is a component of the Endangered Species Act that any federal action that may affect species has to go through what is called Section 7 consultation with the services. So it's actually Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, which lays out the process to consult with Fish and Wildlife Services and National Marine Fisheries Service, NIMS.
I've seen NIMS, and I didn't know what NIMS stood for. Now I do. Thanks.
Yeah, there you go, National Marine Fisheries Service. So any federal action, and it typically has been roads, dams, bridges, those type of things, has to go through a Section 7 consultation with the services, where the services review the project and either, yes, it will threaten some species that's there, or most likely they will come out with a finding of no significant impact, or a FONSI, or not likely to adversely impact. And if that's the case, they will usually mitigate that. You could do some mitigation through a mitigation bank, or there are safe harbor agreements, several other options once you get to that stage. But because EPA is a federal agency, they were required to do Section 7 consultations with the services for pesticide registrations. But for 50 years, they didn't do them.
And I think that's important, that in the examples you gave describing what the Endangered Species Act was, none of those are really, or well, some of those were in years gone by. And so I think it's important for people to understand that this has been on the books since I think 1973 or 4.
Yes.
The EPA was organized in 72, I think.
Correct.
So I mean, it's been,
And it would have been the first main watershed legislation that was passed by the federal
Likely.
government to basically consider not just animals, but also plants.
so
Correct.
this has been, it's technically been required for longer than most of us certainly have been working professionally, but it has not been enforced. Is that the right word, or adhered to by the federal agency, in this case, the EPA?
Short answer is yes. They didn't do them. They've been sued multiple times. The largest one is what we've referred to as the mega suit. The mega suit came out probably in, I want to say 2013, 14, 15, in that time frame. But it was 356 active ingredients that EPA got sued over for not doing the Endangered Species Act consultations. At that time, they entered into a settlement agreement with certain dates and deadlines that EPA would do those. EPA never met those deadlines. So we wind up where we are now with EPA being sued again, losing in court, and having to enter into a settlement agreement with the people that sued them, the NGOs that sued them, to work out a plan to get those consultations done in order to keep the pesticide registration. At the time of the court, they lost that lawsuit. The court basically could have vacated every pesticide label that had not gone through ESA review, and then they would have all had to submit new labels and go through that whole process to get the product back.
Which would basically be everything.
Everything.
That's just, I was going to add that probably is the bulk of the modern day chemicals.
Everything. They're closer now. They have done a few, but it's a minuscule number compared to the number that they have to do.
Isn't that a pretty rigorous process? I mean, I don't want to dive off into the deep end about what you have to go through, but how much can you quickly explain about that? Because that's not a simple process to basically consider each of those active ingredients separately.
Right. And the complicated part of this is that EPA has to do, they have to do a biological evaluation, and they will determine whether it's not going to affect, likely to affect, or will affect. If it's not likely to affect, they won't have to go much further. But if it's likely to affect, then it has to go for consultation with the services, and those can take a while. And it's complicated by the number of people that are involved at each agency and the funding of each agency, because this is going to be a massive undertaking.
And then, too, it's not just a plus or minus on take whatever active ingredient. Most all active ingredients, there are a range of circumstances in which they could be utilized. And so it's not all, like I said, plus and minus or black and white or whatever term you want to refer to it as. Tom, you know Andy pretty well, but you hadn't sat in all these meetings that I have with him on this topic. This dude is the consummate devil's advocate. Because, I mean, if there's going to be a what if, Andy's probably thought of the what if, and the what ifs are endless, right, Andy? I mean, there's
Correct.
just absolutely endless on the scenarios.
Well, and I can only imagine how much information you have to read up on just to stay up to speed on some of these things. And that cannot be easy, because I've done and taken some of those classes where they talk about, fate of chemicals in the environment, like from an ecotoxicological standpoint, and I don't even want to think about all that.
You don't want to read risk assessments
No.
all day, every day?
No.
No, I don't.
I don't want to print them off my computer. I don't want to see them stacked around my office. No. Nope.
So an active ingredient, it goes to a consultation with, just say, the wildlife services.
Right.
If it passes that, assume that, and I know making assumptions in this case is very dangerous, but it does make it to the point of being labeled. Make this example a herbicide, because we do have that herbicide strategy that we have at least seen a draft of it, and soon to be modified draft. But where does it go from there?
It will depend on the biological opinion that comes from Fish and Wildlife Services. If Fish and Wildlife Services come back and says this is not going to affect this species, then it's labeled pretty much just like it was.
All right, when you say this species, which species are you referring to?
Well, it's going to be it's going to have to be evaluated against pretty much all of them that would be in the area in which that product would be used.
And so that's everything, not just species that might be considered under the umbrella of the Endangered Species Act. So these don't necessarily have to be endangered species, isn't that right? And that may be too big a question to even ask.
That's a bigger question, because you already have your MCLs, or your maximum concentration levels, okay, which we have for our products now, tolerances that have gone through the risk assessments for aquaculture, aquatic habitat, the environment. The maximum concentration levels for non-listed species, I think that would still apply in that scenario. But we would apply this Section 7 consultation process is strictly for looking at the threatened and endangered species that are on the list.
A mainstream product that has a wide range of uses, I mean, they have to check off on that for the endangered species listed in Mississippi, which are almost always different than those listed in Alabama or Louisiana or Arkansas or Tennessee, correct?
Yes. You're starting to see how big this is that because you're looking at a product, if the product is sold in all 50 states, it's going to be compared, looked at with all the species in all 50 states.
And aren't some of those going to have to be broken down to the county level? Didn't somebody say at a meeting we were in within the last 2 to 3 years that the one that really stood out to me was the bald eagle is still listed as an endangered species in, say, for example, Sunflower County, Mississippi. Well, if you're down to the county level, there's 82 counties in Mississippi. So when you start talking about doing that for each county and each endangered species potentially within a county, that's a fairly robust list and set of constraints that you're going to have to follow through to complete that.
So without getting too deep into the weeds, thanks to Stanley Culpepper and the work that they're doing, they are refining those species maps, working with Fish and Wildlife Services, so that they are only looking at the product versus the species and trying to get it narrowed down to that area where that species is or has been, trying to get that narrowed down, because yes, I mean, this could be a huge undertaking. There's well over 1,000 species on the threatened and endangered species list, and they are everything from insects to mammals, obviously plants. And one of the problems is that if you take a non-selective herbicide, it's designed to kill plants. So the important thing is to make sure that the product is not winding up where those plants are. That is the key component to it, is exposure. And that's what fish looks at a lot. It's not just the toxicity to the threatened or endangered species, but also the proximity of the use and the likelihood that it will adversely affect that species. Jason and I talked, if you look at pondberry bush in the Mississippi Delta, clethodim is probably not going to affect or adversely affect pondberry bush just because of the mode of action of that herbicide.
And the fact that pondberry is a broadleaf plant.
Right. Yes. It's a huge undertaking.
And then, of course, those species overlap. And again, in the case of herbicides, because that's where my brain always goes to, we make applications of combinations of herbicides. So if one has a different assessment than the other, it adversely affects a species, but the one applied in mixture with it doesn't. Well, then that compromises your mixture, and it just gets very complex very quickly.
And slightly convoluted.
Well, that was my original word, and I swapped to complex.
See where my brain went.
All right, Andy, so then describe these strategies. I mean, we've heard the words herbicide strategy, but there's also a fungicide strategy. In Tom's case, there will be an insecticide strategy. So where do those documents or whatever they technically are, where do they factor into this process?
Okay, to bring the circle, to close the circle up, EPA got sued. The court said you didn't do these. EPA entered into the settlement agreement with the plaintiffs, and what they did was they developed these strategies as basically a bridge to get from where we are today to until the consultations are done with the services. So we're in that bridge process because EPA estimates that it's going to take them about 40 years just to get through the actives that they've been sued on, not the entire portfolio. So they are developing these strategies.
Tom's rolling his eyes. That's encouraging, huh?
I'm just doing, quick, simple math. So at about the end of my existence
we'll be
on
dead
this
and gone
planet,
in 40 years.
yes, I'll be somewhere in a home.
Yeah, it's going to take me through retirement for sure. But so the strategies are this bridge program to get to the consultations. And what it is basically adding mitigation to a product label that will essentially limit or manage that off-target movement. So there's a herbicide strategy, came out in July of last year. They received several comments, and I think through that comment period, they realized that that was a bridge too far. It was going to be entirely too complicated. They backed up, and they got an extension of the date that they would have to have a final strategy put out. So the herbicide strategy final is now going to be put out by August 30th of 2024. And it is the framework at which EPA will look at herbicide labels as they go through the review process, and new actives would automatically go through this process. But for existing products, they will go through their regular registration review process. So while the herbicide strategy is out there, it does not automatically apply to every active immediately. Most of them it will hit further down the road in the registration review process. Then we expect the draft insecticide strategy will be out by July 30th of 2024. The rodenticide strategy will be final in November of 2024. And then August of this year, EPA and the plaintiffs are supposed to meet to develop a timeline for the fungicide strategy. But this is the framework at which EPA will develop the mitigations for the product labels.
For example, and correct me if I'm wrong when I describe this, Andy. So if I want to use this herbicide, let's call it herbicide A because we don't want to bring any undue attention to anything, but that herbicide is going to carry what amounts to a point system, and I have to accumulate a set number of points in order to legally use this herbicide. And the points accumulate based on mitigation
strategies.
Yeah, and I didn't want to use the word strategy practices because of the herbicide strategy, insecticide strategy. So practices. So it may be doing one application instead of 3. It may be some type of buffer. It may be rates. Just a variety of different things.
Yes.
Some of which are what you could categorize as low-hanging fruit, and some would be more pie-in-the-sky level things. Either way, each one would have its unique number of points that you have to accumulate from a pick list. We hear the word pick list sometimes, in order to go out, load your sprayer with this product, and go treat a field.
That is our understanding of how this mitigation strategy will work, is that there are a number of points assigned to particular conservation measures. And EPA has entered into an MOU with USDA and NRCS. So pretty much the entire suite of NRCS practices is going to be available and have some level of points associated with it. And then EPA has a method or process that they use to assign point values to the herbicide. For instance, a herbicide may have 6 points, or may require 6 points of mitigation. And then you would look at the suite of practices. No-till may be worth 1 point, cover crop maybe 2 points, edge of field buffer would have a certain number of points, pads and pipes are what they call a field border, a raised field border. We call them pads and pipes. But so there are a lot of practices that we already do that will have points associated with them, and you will have to have enough of those conservation measure mitigation points added up to equal the number of points associated with that particular herbicide.
And this is going to be required for each product.
This will be on the label. So, the label is the law. So there will also be what we would refer to as, or they refer to as, interim ecological measures. And those are pretty narrative mitigations, but we would just say practices, nozzle size, don't apply within 48 hours of a rain event, wind speed. Those type of things will also be on there, but there are no points associated with those. Those are just separate interim ecological measures that we would do to reduce drift or off-target movement. And then you get into the conservation practices that are associated with it.
Like we said when we started, this is complex, and we've been talking about it for a while. And what do you say to a guy in Mississippi or girl? Maybe they're a grower, maybe they're a consultant, but what positive word do you have for them at this point in this evolution of how we're going to operate, if you have any positive word for them?
Well, the positive that EPA has been fairly easy to work with, and they have listened. They're not here because they want to be. They were forced here by this lawsuit. So this is court mandated. They don't have much of a choice but to do something in order for us to keep labels. So this mitigation strategy is as complex as it is and as onerous as it seems to be now. We are working with them and they are working with us to try and make it as workable as possible. They were very open to our suggestion to use the NRCS suite of practices and not develop new definitions for what those are, to maintain the continuity there. So we're already doing a lot of those things that are going to be required, but we already have a lot of those in place. It gets very complicated when you look at a lot of the practices that would work in the hills or upper Midwest that won't apply, say, in the Mississippi Delta where the land is flat. We're not going to terrace a lot of this land here. So you eliminate a lot of the practices that you'd be eligible for just from the fact that they don't work everywhere. So the suite of practices has to be pretty large, and they recognize that. That's one of the changes that they have made from the draft framework that came out. So the positive is that they are pretty open to working with us and trying to understand the challenges. And at the same time, this is just the framework. So as each label comes out, we will have an opportunity to participate and comment on those individual labels. So we'll get another bite at the apple to make sure that what they're asking is reasonable and makes sense, that is protective of the species, but also allows the producer to grow a crop and protect his investment.
We all work pretty closely with farmers in this state, and the one thing I think is impressed upon us is lots of times they don't want to spend a tremendous amount of time in front of the computer, but commenting on these things is extremely important and needs to be coming from that aspect of the community and the people that actually use these regulations to actually apply those products. Hearing from them is extremely important. So careful, short, sweet, thoughtful comments are important. And I mean, we each of us could try to stress that, but that is really important.
Absolutely. Yes, they want to hear from producers, and it does not have to be anything extremely elaborate. You can do it anonymously if you don't want your name there, but it's a fairly simple process at regulations.gov. Once you have the docket ID number, you can just go in. There's a little box there, and you can type your comment into that little box. And it basically is, I farm in such and such county. I raise these crops. This action will affect me this way. Or I'm already doing these things. And don't be afraid. If it's something good they're doing, don't be afraid to tell them that they're doing a good job. But this is one of those where they need to understand how this actually works in the field, on the ground, because we know that regionally farms may be the same, but as the region gets larger, you're very diverse, your farming practices and what the farm actually looks like. Farms in the Delta don't look a lot like most of the farms in the hills on the eastern side of the state. When you have extremely large buffers and you have somebody that's farming 40-acre fields, that eliminates a lot of that field. We tried to stress that point that those large buffers may work in one area, but we may need to look at something else in another part of the state. So one size fits all, it doesn't really work for this type of program.
Andy, we appreciate it. We appreciate Farm Bureau. We love working with you guys. And to our listeners, I can vouch for the fact that Farm Bureau is knee-deep in all of this, and they are fighting to get what's best for Mississippi in this situation. So, Andy, thanks, man.
Well, thank y'all for having me. I appreciate it.
I appreciate spending time with you, man.
Yeah, no problem.
The Mississippi Crop Situation Podcast is a production of Mississippi State University Extension.